The most Italian dish in the world wasn't invented in Italy. And that's just the beginning of what the history books quietly left out. In the next few minutes, you're going to find out about a medieval English recipe that predates Italy's most famous version by centuries. You're going to hear about a regional war inside Italy that is, according to food historians, still technically ongoing. And you're going to learn why the lasagna you've eaten your entire life was quietly engineered by corporations to taste nothing like the original, and why that was entirely on purpose. But the question nobody has ever satisfactorily answered is this: who actually gets credit for the dish that feeds more families every Sunday than almost any other meal on Earth? We'll get there. But the answer is going to make you uncomfortable. Here's what most people assume. Lasagna is ancient Italian, born somewhere in Bologna, perfected by generations of Italian grandmothers and exported to the world as a gift from a single unified culinary culture. The documented record tells a different story. The oldest written recipe resembling lasagna doesn't come from an Italian kitchen. It comes from a 14th century English cookbook called The Form of Curry, reportedly compiled for the court of King Richard II around 1390. The dish was called lasagnes, flat pasta sheets layered with cheese and spices, baked together. Sound familiar? Now, Italian food scholars will point out, and they're not wrong, that pasta layering traditions almost certainly existed in Italy well before anyone wrote them down. The problem is the word almost. In history, almost doesn't count. Meanwhile, inside Italy, the argument about who really owns lasagna has been running hot for centuries. The city of Bologna has long claimed the dish as its birthright, and in 1982, the Italian Academy of Cuisine went so far as to officially register a single, authorized lasagna recipe with the Bologna Chamber of Commerce: green pasta sheets, bolognese meat sauce, bechamel. That's it. That's the law as far as Bologna is concerned. But Naples has a competing claim just as old, and southern Italian cooks have been putting ricotta in lasagna since before Bologna drafted its constitution. Neither side is fully wrong, and neither side is ready to admit that. The deeper you go into lasagna's origins, the more one thing becomes clear. This dish has never belonged to any single person, city, or country. It has always been contested territory. But the contest got a lot more lopsided once money entered the picture. When Italian immigrants arrived in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they brought their regional food traditions with them, including dozens of variations of layered pasta dishes. And for decades, those traditions lived quietly inside immigrant communities, specific to a neighborhood, a family, a region of origin. Then the American food industry noticed. By the mid-20th century, food companies had begun standardizing, canning, and mass-producing what they labeled lasagna, and the version they chose to scale wasn't the hand-rolled, slow-cooked, regionally specific original. It was a flattened, simplified, shelf-stable approximation built around what American consumers already recognized as comforting: ground beef, tomato, and melted cheese. The nuance got stripped out, the regional variation got erased, and the immigrant families who carried the real recipes across an ocean got no credit, no royalty, and no acknowledgement on any label. According to food historians, this pattern, authentic ethnic cuisine simplified and scaled for mass commercial appeal, with the originating community removed from the story, is one of the most documented dynamics in American culinary history. Lasagna is just one of its clearest examples. So what did the original actually look like? Because if you've only ever eaten the version from your local Italian-American chain, the one sitting under that 3 for $12 deal on the Olive Garden menu the last time you scrolled through their app on a Tuesday night, you've eaten something the dish's earliest makers would not recognize at all. The original Bolognese version used green pasta, colored with spinach, rolled thin by hand. The ragu was slow cooked for hours, built on sofrito and wine, not a jar. There was no ricotta, there was no mozzarella. The binding agent was bechamel, a white sauce that takes patience and technique to get right. The version most Americans grew up eating flips almost every one of those decisions. Dried pasta sheets, often pre-cooked, ricotta instead of bechamel because it's faster, ground beef browned in 10 minutes, not simmered for 3 hours, a layer of shredded mozzarella thick enough to hide everything underneath. Neither version is objectively wrong, but they are answering completely different questions. The original asks, how do I honor this ingredient? The modern version asks, how do I feed more people faster? Would the cooks who spent centuries developing that layered technique, that specific pasta color, that precise sauce balance, would they look at what sits on 90% of American dinner tables and call it the same dish? Almost certainly not. So who actually deserves credit? Hold that thought, because before we answer that, some things you almost definitely have wrong about this dish. First, the word lasagna almost certainly doesn't come from Italian at all. The leading theory among food etymologists traces it back to the Greek word lasanon, which referred to a chamber pot. The Romans borrowed the word to describe a cooking vessel. The dish got named after the pot it was cooked in, not the other way around. Second, the tomato wasn't in any European lasagna until the late 1800s at the absolute earliest. Tomatoes were considered poisonous by many Europeans for centuries after arriving from the Americas. Every lasagna recipe before that used white sauce, cheese, or spiced meat mixtures. The tomato red lasagna you picture as traditional is, historically speaking, a very recent invention. Third, in Italy today, there are documented regional lasagna variations so different from one another that Italian food scholars argue some of them shouldn't share the same name. Lasagna in Emilia-Romagna has nothing structurally in common with lasagna in Calabria. They're the same word applied to two almost entirely different dishes. And fourth, the frozen lasagna sitting in your supermarket freezer right now is, by volume sold, one of the most consumed pasta dishes on the planet. Not fresh pasta from a trattoria in Bologna, a frozen block in a cardboard box. The dish traveled centuries to get to that freezer aisle, and the people who made that journey possible got written out of the story. Now, back to the open question. Who actually deserves credit for lasagna? Here's the twist that reframes everything we've covered. The 1982 Bologna registration, that official, notarized, legally recorded lasagna recipe, was an act of desperation, not pride. It wasn't created because Italian food culture was thriving. It was created because Italian food scholars watched the American food industry spend 30 years selling the world a product under the Italian flag that had almost nothing to do with Italian culinary tradition, and they panicked. The official recipe wasn't a declaration of ownership, it was damage control. Which means the most authentic version of lasagna in existence, the one with the government seal, the one food purists point to, the one Italian cooking schools teach, was written in response to American commercial food culture. The thing it was trying to resist had already shaped it. Bologna didn't preserve lasagna's original identity. American fast food culture forced Bologna to define one in the first place. The dish you think of as ancient, traditional, and purely Italian exists in its current documented form because of a corporate frozen food aisle in suburban America. Let that sit for a moment. Every dish on your table has a version of this story underneath it, a real history that got simplified, commercialized, or quietly erased. And the further back you look, the less it resembles what ended up on your plate. That's what this channel exists to find. If this kind of story is what you came here for, subscribe, because next week we're pulling back the curtain on another dish whose origin story is even messier than this one. And here's what I want to know from you. What's the dish you grew up eating that you've always assumed had a clean, simple history, and now you're not so sure? Drop it in the comments. The most interesting answer gets featured in an upcoming episode.